But look, Godfrey, stand by, because I want to talk now about this really, really shocking sham Muslim report, which has wrongly slammed GB News. And totally inappropriately, Clive Myrie, who has a reputation, of course, as being one of our greatest newsreaders. Yeah, right. He's just a champagne socialist like the rest of them, taking tens of thousands of pounds to give speeches while propagating political viewpoints as a paid newsreader at the BBC. He was the one that actually promoted this today with a very, very clear political agenda. So I think he should be sacked for that. But this was his tweet. GB News broadcasts half of all UK stories about Muslims, analysis shows. Now, I immediately responded to Mr. Myrie saying, do you not understand that that is actually an indictment of you, the British bashing corporation? You have spent more time nasal gazing over Greg Wallace than you ever have reporting the grooming gang scandal or scourge of extreme Islam being taught to young Brits in their mosques. Shame. But let me take you through this Guardian report to give you a little bit of an idea of what they are trying to claim. So the Guardian writes, GB News accounted for half of all news broadcast coverage of Muslims over a 2-year period, much of it negative, according to new analysis. The findings demonstrate an excessive focus on Muslims, bordering on an obsession. According to this report by the Centre for Media Monitoring, researchers allege the stories about Islam are overwhelmingly negative and fail to understand the diverse nature of Muslim communities in the UK. They said the coverage could fuel community tensions and contribute to civil unrest. And of course, the usual suspects are absolutely backing this 2-year analysis. But Godfrey Bloom, I think they've got this completely wrong. I think they've completely misunderstood that, in fact, all this shows is that GB News is reporting the real issues. And when I was there, I would talk all the time about the scourge of grooming gangs, Islam extremism, people like Shamima Begum. And actually, what you find, Godfrey, is that the mainstream media, as you've already pointed out today, a very dishonest legacy media in the UK, just want to ignore these issues. They pretend they're not happening. So much of the bias in the media, Godfrey, is about story selection and what they choose not to report.
You're absolutely right. Now, the whole concept of this is very much more complex, I suspect, than most people would imagine. So, for example, there are now more Muslims in the country than there are Welshmen in Wales. So we are dealing with an enormous number of people, and it's not just a question of cultures, it's different cultures, different attitudes, so on and so forth, that some of these religions have. Now, of course, some of them are different. So you have, for example, the Ahmadiyya Muslims, who are very integrationist, very businesslike, and quite big in my Euro constituency in the West Riding of Yorkshire. And I used to go to sometimes to some of their curry lunches, which were jolly good. And these are very integrationist, very nice, very balanced people. And there was lots of Maseratis and Aston Martins because they bought into the capitalist society. And one of them was actually murdered by other Muslims for putting up in his shop, you might remember a few years ago, of putting in his shop window, "Happy Christmas to all my customers." And he was murdered by other Muslims. So what I think would be helpful to avoid this kind of critique, as it were, is to run, if I were running the channel, for example, I would say, let's have a broader look here. Let's look at what the Ahmadiyya Muslims say, the very successful community in parts of this country. So, you know, they're very integrationist. Let's have a look, because a lot of people are largely ignorant about these matters. Now, I know Sikhs aren't Muslims, so I'm not trying to say that, but we know how integrationist and welcome the Sikhs are. The Sikhs, and I have a regimental association with us as well. I must say, I must run my flag up the flag there. I'm very pro-Sikh because I think they've bought into our community and they have an excellent track record militarily with us, and so on and so forth. So there is immigration, which is good. and there is immigration which is bad. Now, that's something this country hasn't talked about at all. What is good immigration? What is welcome immigration? And what is not? And that needs to open up. And the other thing alongside that, if I may say, this sometimes gets me into hot water, but I'm used to hot water. Let's have a look at the unseen. You can see the Muslim thing. You can see the dynamic that we see with the BBC and media, so that we can see all that. But there's also another flip side to that, which is the unseen Zionist support within the media and banking and so on and so forth, and of course on the Hill in Washington, and a lot of which we don't see, so on and so forth. There's a whole can of worms here. There's a whole can of worms that need to be investigated, and I think it would do good for everybody on all channels. It's not going to happen with the BBC. It's never going to happen with the BBC to say, just a minute, let's have a lot more wider. Let's have a more wider approach to what the problems actually are, and how very often bringing lots of people in from a different cultural background who don't want to be assimilated are a threat to our culture and our way of life. And I think that would be a very much more constructive way of approaching these matters. That isn't a criticism of GB News. That's not a criticism. It's just saying I'd like to broaden the discussion.
Indeed, but this is now becoming mainstream, the sectarian politics in the UK. And I want to show you what I think most people, including myself, think is an extraordinary moment in the House of Commons this afternoon. So Iqbal Muhammad is the new independent MP for Dewsbury and Batley, but he's in this pro-Gaza grouping of independent MPs led by Jeremy Corbyn. And in Parliament today, he has argued against a law that would make it illegal for there to be marriages between first cousins. So let's have a watch along of this now. I think it's worth listening to.
Documented health risks with first cousin marriage. And I agree this is an issue, this is an issue that needs greater awareness on. Virginity testing, forced marriages, and the freedom of women must be forced marriage must be prevented, and the freedom of women must be protected at all times. However, the way to redress this is not to empower the state to ban adults from marrying each other, not least because I don't think it would be effective or enforceable. Instead, the matter needs to be approached as a health awareness issue and a cultural issue where women are being forced against their will to undergo marriage. In doing so, it is important to recognise for many people this is a highly sensitive issue, and in discussing it, we should try to step into the shoes of those who perhaps are not from the same culture as ours, to better understand why the practice continues to be so widespread. An estimated 35 to 50% of all sub-Saharan African populations either prefer or accept cousin marriages, and it is extremely common in the Middle East and in South Asia.
And it may well be Godfrey Bloom, but it's completely unhealthy from a medical point of view, but it goes totally against our culture. And isn't that the point?
That is indeed the point, but there is a reason for it being against our culture. There is a reason for all this, and that is, you're quite right, and you hit upon it first time. That's the health aspect. And if you go to parts of West Yorkshire, and I suspect other bits I don't know so well, where these practices predominate, I think you'll find that you can tell immediately, who is the child of such a marriage. They are very small, very weak, probably hunchbacked, so on and so forth. And you can spot them a mile away. It's not 100%, of course it's not, but it's very close. It's very close to some form of physical deformity, that close. There's a reason. But you've got to understand, and this is something that people don't understand, it gets me into trouble again. This branch of Islam, if you will, is 700, came to the fore, as it were, around about 700 AD. When Christianity came to the fore, of course, in 100 or 200 AD. So as far as cultural matters are concerned, it's a young religion. It's still quite a young religion. People forget that. And if you go back to Christianity in the Middle Ages, we were making a lot of these mistakes as well. So the point is, they don't seem to want to learn from the mistakes we made when we were doing the same things in the Middle Ages. But certainly, I think it's perfectly reasonable for us to say marriage, that kind of marriage, is not welcome and not right in this country, especially, Dan, when we have a welfare state and an NHS. To deliberately breed people who are actually not quite well through this practice, then it falls on your neighbour to actually subsidize these things. And I think we need a much more broader outlook. We're not saying, just a minute, you can't do this, but you also, this guy, I've forgotten his name, he can't hide behind the fact we've got a different culture, so we can do these things. Well, actually anti-human. No, you can't get away with that. Oh, he might go say, I'd like to crucify Christians because that's my religion.
Yeah, but the
The
problem we've got is that Labour has created this situation by throwing open our borders. Now, yes, that was continued by the Conservative Party, but what Labour is now facing, Godfrey, is potential extinction because they're being challenged on the right from Reform UK, but challenged on the left by what I believe are extreme Islam candidates. So if you look at, for example, the results in Dewsbury and Batley at the last election, that was a Labour seat. Labour had someone running in the seat called Heather Iqbal. So by her name, you would assume that she was also a Muslim woman. But it wasn't even close. Godfrey, it wasn't even close. This guy, Iqbal Muhammad, got 15,641 votes. Heather Iqbal got 8,700 votes. Now, Reform UK was in third place. But my point is, Labour has to pay lip service to this extremism, doesn't it? Because otherwise they are facing electoral wipeout in key constituencies.
Yes, exactly. And of course, this game is played very well. So when I was having lunches and various things with different Muslim sects in my constituency in West Yorkshire, they played a very canny game. They're not stupid. So I would go to a lunch, maybe on Pakistan Day, for example, just to pick an example of that. And there would be Lib Dem councillors, Conservative councillors, and Labour councillors, all from the same family. They had a finger in every pie, and that's exactly what they do. And of course they wouldn't they? But that's also within their culture. It's also within the African culture, if you like. As soon as you get elected, what's the first thing you do? You put your brother-in-law in that job, and your mate in that job, and your wife in that job, and so it goes on. That is the name of the game. And of course, if you are a professional politician, which is most of the mainstream parties are, they have to play that game because they need to win that seat. There's a fundamental flaw, of course, which we haven't discussed yet, Dan, and it's a long discussion for another day probably. We have a flawed political system. Until we face the fact we have a representative democracy has failed, dismally failed. And we need to restore it. We need to look at the whole thing again and come up with a much better system. So we can't have these seats gerrymandered as we do.
No, indeed. And I would say the start of that would be a change to the electoral system. But yes, conversation for another day.
As most of you know, my work is very heavily independently research-based. And I get my information from all over the world. It would help if you press the subscribe button and the little bell next to it, because the more subscribers I have, the more likely it is that international independent research institutes will share their material with me. It's most helpful, and then of course I automatically share it with you. So, surprise, won't cost you anything. Thank you very much.